The cattlemen sneered when the crippled girl approached the horse. No one could ride. The rope was still bleeding my palm when Harlan Sutter laughed. Not at the horse. At me. Or near enough. He turned to the two men beside him on the top rail and said something low, and they laughed too, and that was enough, that little three-man huddle of sound, to tell me everything I needed to know about what the next 6 weeks were going to feel like on the Sutter spread. I'd been hired to break the roan. That was the deal. $35 and board, which was fair money, and I wasn't in a position to refuse fair money. My left knee had been ground to something close to gravel by a horse that rolled on me outside of Tucson 2 years prior, and by then I was walking with a hitch that wasn't going to straighten out, and the kind of work I'd always done, the rough string, the outlaws, the green 3-year-olds that nobody else wanted in the pen with them. That work was getting harder to find because nobody wants to put a limping man in with a 1,200-pound animal that hasn't yet decided whether a human being is a predator or a piece of furniture. Reasonable. I understood the logic. Didn't mean I had to enjoy it. The roan's name on the Sutter books was Diablo. They bought him off a Comanchero trader who'd taken him from somewhere else, and the animal had about 4 different stories living inside him, none of them peaceful. 16.5 hands, deep chest, neck that sat on his shoulders like a keg of powder, color like a bad sunset, reddish and dark at the edges. He put 2 men on the ground in the time since they'd trailed him up from the Rio, one of them with a broken collarbone, one with a wrist that healed wrong and still sat crooked. I watched him for 2 days before I went near him. That was my way. Some men go right at a horse because they think speed reads as confidence. I'm not one of those men. I stood at the fence and I watched him move, and I watched where his eye went, and I watched what made his hip swing away, and what made him pull his neck up into that locked-up vertical that means a horse is 10 seconds from becoming a disaster. I watched until I understood the shape of his fear, because that's all it ever is with a horse. Fear. Something happened to him, probably more than once, and now he carries it the way a man carries a scar on the inside, tender, invisible, and absolutely in charge of everything. Harlan Sutter watched me watch the horse, and I could feel his judgment from 40 yards. He was the kind of man who read stillness as laziness, because he'd never in his life been still enough to learn anything. The girl I didn't notice at first. That sounds bad. I don't mean it the way it sounds. I mean I was focused, and she was quiet, and she had positioned herself on the far side of the corral from the knot of ranch hands in a way that read as deliberate. She was maybe 20, maybe a touch older, dark hair pulled back, a plain dress work-worn, and she walked with a crutch, one of the wooden ones, shaped to fit under the arm because her left leg ended just below the knee. Not a boot on that side, just the end of the trouser leg tied off. She was watching the horse the way I was watching the horse. I found out later she was Harlan Sutter's niece. Her name was Clara. Her father, Harlan's brother, dead 3 years, had left her with nothing except the obligation to her uncle's household, which in practical terms meant she cooked and mended, and was allowed to be present as long as she kept out of the way and didn't cost anything. The other women on the place treated her with the particular cruelty of women who are afraid of being associated with misfortune, which is to say they were polite to her face and talked about her behind it. The hands mostly didn't look at her directly, the way you don't look directly at something you can't categorize. She looked at the horse like it was the one honest thing on the property. I didn't speak to her the first day or the second. I'm not a man who talks easily to strangers, and I had enough on my mind with the roan. Third morning I came out early before the crew was up, and she was already there at the fence, just standing, watching him circle. I came up and stood beside her, and we watched together for a while without either one of us saying anything, and that was how I knew she was serious. Eventually I said, "He circles counterclockwise when he's nervous." She didn't look at me, kept her eyes on the roan, said, "He circles toward the gate when he wants company and away from it when he doesn't. Right now he's circling toward it, but he won't look at it. He wants company, but he doesn't trust it." I didn't say anything to that, because she was right, exactly right. And I'd been watching this horse for 3 days. She finally looked at me. Something steady in her face, not hostile, not soft either, just level. Like she was giving me a fair assessment the same way I'd be giving her one. "You're the man they hired to break him," she said. "That's right. You're not going to break him," she said. "He's been broken already, more than once, that's the problem." I thought about that for most of the morning. Her name was Clara Denton. She told me that on the 4th day when we were both at the fence again in the early quiet, and she said it like she was completing a transaction we'd started, giving me the one thing she'd held back. I told her mine. Amos. Amos Carver. She nodded like she was filing it away. She'd grown up around horses. Her father had kept a small place and a few head before the fever took him, and before that, before whatever accident or illness had taken her leg, she didn't say and I didn't ask, she'd ridden. You could tell from the way she stood near them. Not careful, the way people are when they're afraid. Present, like she was in conversation. "Why do they call him Diablo?" she said once. "He's not mean, he's terrified." "Because it's easier to call a thing evil than to understand what made it that way," I said. She looked at me then, and the look was one I hadn't gotten from anyone in a long time. Not pity, not appraisal. Something more considered than either, like I'd said something that matched up with something she already knew. I started the real work with the roan that week, not forcing. Not the usual round penning where you chase a horse until he submits out of exhaustion and confusion. Just presence. Just being in the pen with him and doing nothing. Standing there. Moving slow. Letting him come to me on his terms, which he wasn't going to do for days, and that was fine. That was the work. You either have the patience for it or you don't, and most men don't, and that's why most men's horses know they're afraid. Harlan Sutter watched this for 2 days, and on the 3rd day he came to the fence and said, "I'm paying you $35 to stand in a pen doing nothing." I said, "That's right." He waited for more. I didn't give him more. He walked off, and one of his hands, a young one, thick-necked, the kind who laughs loudest when the foreman does, said something to the back of my head. I didn't turn around. I've been not turning around at things said to my back for most of my adult life. You get good at it. Not because you're soft, because you learn the difference between what costs you something real and what's only noise. Clara was there at the fence that evening, after the hands had gone in. She'd watched the whole Sutter exchange. "He does that to everyone he can't rattle," she said. "Does it work on most?" "Most," she said, "not on you." "Not on you either from what I've seen." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It worked on me for a long time. It stopped working when I ran out of things he could take." I turned that over for a while. There was something in it that I recognized. The specific freedom of a man or a woman who has already lost the things they were afraid of losing. You'd think it would feel like defeat. It doesn't. It feels like ground. The roan let me touch his neck for the first time on a Thursday morning. Just for a second. His whole body flinched and then held still, like he was making a decision against his own instincts. I stood there with my hand flat against the muscle of his neck, and I didn't move and I didn't breathe much, and after maybe 15 seconds he moved his head slightly toward me instead of away. Small thing, everything. I told Clara about it that evening. She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile, and it changed her face in a way that was hard to look away from, not because it was pretty, though it was, but because it was real. There was nothing performed about it. It was just a woman smiling because something good had happened and she was glad about it, and she wasn't going to hide that she was glad. "You're going to get him," she said. "Maybe." "No," she said, "you are, I can tell." "How?" "Because you're not in a hurry," she said. "He can feel that. Animals can feel when you're not trying to take something from them." I thought about asking her where she'd learned that. Decided it was a thing she'd learned the same place I had, from having too much taken. It went on like that through the end of October. The work with the roan, slow and real. The mornings and some evenings at the fence with Clara. The low-grade hostility from Harlan Sutter that never quite became the direct confrontation he was working himself up to, because I kept giving him nothing to hook onto. There were things I noticed about her that I didn't intend to notice. The way she moved on the crutch, not struggling against it, just moving. The way a river moves around a rock, like the adjustment was entirely natural. The way she thought before she spoke, every time, so that what she said was always what she meant. The fact that she read, she had 3 books in her room that she'd brought from her father's place, and she'd read each of them until the spines were cracked through. The way she talked to the horses when she thought no one was listening. Not baby talk, actual conversation. The kind you'd have with someone whose opinion you respected. I was 53 years old and had been alone for 14 years, and I was not a man who thought much about what he wanted anymore, because wanting things that weren't going to happen is a particular kind of torture, and I'd given it up. Or I'd thought I'd given it up. The roan carried his first saddle on the 1st of November. Not a rider, just the saddle. I cinched it slow and stood back, and he gassed up and turned in circles, and then stood there breathing hard, and then stood there breathing normal, and then turned his head and looked at me with the one dark eye, and I looked back, and we had some kind of understanding. Clara was at the fence. She said, "There he is." I said, "There he is." 2 days later I rode him for the first time. Not a rodeo, just a walk. Around the pen, then a stop, then a walk the other direction, then a stop. He was tense under me like a drawn bowstring, but he didn't blow and he didn't quit, and when I swung down he turned and pushed his nose against my chest. Just once. Then he walked away. Harlan Sutter was there by then with 4 or 5 of his men, because word had gone around that I was going to try to ride him. I heard the surprise in the silence that replaced the talk. I didn't look over. I unsaddled the roan and brushed him down and led him to the water trough, and that was the end of the day's work. One of the hands, not the thick-necked one, a quieter one named Foss, came up to me afterward and said, "I'll be damned." Not hostile, genuine, like he was admitting something. Harlan Sutter didn't say anything. That was its own kind of thing. The trouble came the 2nd week of November. I don't know exactly what happened. I wasn't there for the start of it. What I pieced together later was that Clara had gone to the barn to check on a mare that had been running a fever, and 2 of the hands had followed her in. And what happened in there was at minimum the kind of conversation that a woman alone shouldn't have to have with 2 men who have decided the rules don't apply to them. I came into the barn and she was standing against the far wall, and the 2 of them were between her and the door. One of them, the thick-necked one, Pryor was his name, had her crutch, was holding it out to the side, like a joke, like a thing he could take and give back whenever he decided. I said his name once. He turned and looked at me, and I could see him working out whether I was something he needed to take seriously. I said, "Give it back." He didn't right away. He looked at me, and then he looked at the other one, and then he looked back at me, and whatever he saw in my face made him put the crutch down on the stall railing without another word. Not because he was afraid exactly. Because something in how I was standing said I was prepared to go a long way with this, and he wasn't. They left. She came over and picked up the crutch and stood straight and looked at me. Didn't fall apart. Didn't thank me in the way that would have made it smaller than it was. She just looked at me for a long moment with those level eyes and said, "Amos." That was all, just my name. But the way she said it, like I was someone she'd been looking for, lodged itself in my chest and didn't move. I told Harlan Sutter what had happened. He listened with the face of a man hearing an inconvenience rather than a wrong. He said Pryor was a good hand and he'd have a talk with him. I said that wasn't enough. He said that was what was going to happen. I said I was finished with the roan. $35 said he was broken, and he was broken and we were done. Sutter blinked. He hadn't expected that. He started to say something about the money, about the remaining time on the agreement, and I said I'd ride out in the morning and he could keep the last week's board. That evening, Clara came to find me where I was packing my saddlebags in the small room off the bunkhouse. She stood in the doorway. She had her 3 books in the crook of her arm, wrapped in a piece of canvas. I looked at the books and then at her. She said, "I'm not staying here either." I said, "Clara," meaning, "you don't have to do this on my account." She said, "I'm not doing it on your account. I've wanted to leave for a year, I just needed." She stopped, looked at the floor for a second, and then back up. I needed to know there was somewhere to go. I thought about that. "I'm not going anywhere particular," I said. "I've got maybe $40 and a horse, and I don't know yet what comes next." "I know," she said. "I'm 53 years old and I walk with a limp." "I know that too," she said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I don't know that that's relevant." I looked at her. She looked at me. Outside, the roan moved in the corral, hooves soft on the packed dirt, just the sound of him circling. "You sure?" I said. "I've been sure for 2 months," she said. "I was waiting to see if you'd figure it out." We rode out before sunup. She rode the mare she'd been nursing, who was sound again by then. I rode the roan, who moved under me like something finally translated into the right language. The valley was cold and dark, and the stars were still up, and nobody saw us go. The mountains were a dark shape to the north, and the road went west, and we took it. She rode beside me and not behind me. I noticed that. She rode beside me the way someone rides who has decided they are going somewhere. I didn't say much for the first hour, neither did she. After a while she reached across the gap between our horses and put her hand on my arm, not grabbing, just her hand there resting on my coat sleeve, warm through the wool. She looked straight ahead at the road. I looked at her hand on my arm, then I looked at the road too. The roan's ears were forward, moving towards something, for the first time in his life, instead of away from it. That's the thing I remember most when I think about that morning. Not the cold, not the relief of being off the Sutter place, not even her hand, though that's close. It's the roan's ears pointing forward, both of them, like he'd decided the world ahead was worth going toward. I know the feeling. 3 months later, we were on a small place outside of a town called Ridgeway, near the Colorado line. Not much, a cabin that needed work, a few acres, a fence that was more suggestion than boundary. I was breaking horses again, slow ones, the kind nobody else had patience for, and the word had gotten around that I was good at it and fair about it, and the work was coming in steady. The town knew about Clara before it knew much about me. Women talk. Not unkindly, that town, they weren't Sutter's people. One of the women from the church came out to the place and brought a pie and sat in our kitchen and talked with Clara for an hour, and when she left she looked at me at the door and said, "You've got yourself a fine woman there, Mr. Carver." Said it straight, like a statement of fact. I said, "I know it. I do know it." Last spring a man came through looking for someone to evaluate a string of Apache broke horses he was thinking of buying, and he'd heard my name and rode out. Young man, maybe 30. He stood at the fence and watched me work for a while, and then he said it like he was puzzling it out. "They say you're the best horse breaker north of Santa Fe. You don't look like much." I said no. He thought I'd take offense. I didn't. I'm past the age of needing to be looked at right. I know what I am and what I can do, and there's one woman in this world who has known it since the morning she stood beside me at a fence in the cold, and told me a horse was circling toward the gate because it wanted company. That evening after the young man left, Clara was at the corral fence, watching a new one I just started on, a gray, suspicious and fast, with a lot of good horse underneath the fear if you could get to it. I came and stood beside her, and we watched him together in the last of the light, the way we always do. She leaned into my side. I put my arm around her. Her hand came up and held my wrist. We stood like that until the gray stopped circling and came to the fence.